Prince Harry's written statement, in all of its 55 PDF pages of glory, has been released, in his case concerning MGM. And since it is 55 pages and no one has an attention span anymore, I am going to summarize what I feel are the highlights from it. But I'm actually going to start from the end and open with his claim against the Mirror Group, because I think it's important, and just in case you don't stay with me the whole way through. This is dated February 24th, 2023. I'm paraphrasing, but he opens up by saying that he understands the importance and fully accepts and agrees with the fact that journalists and the media have the right to investigate anyone, especially if you're funded by the taxpayer. Quote, "The problem is that over the last 15 to 20 years, there are now incredibly powerful media companies who masquerade as journalists and who have quite literally hijacked journalistic privileges for their own personal gain and agenda." End quote. He goes on to say that they claim to hold public figures to account without any accountability for themselves. Quote, "They're supposedly policing society. Who on earth is policing them when even the government is scared of alienating them because position is power?" End quote. He makes it very clear that he thinks this problem is much bigger and it involves the UK government. Which, yeah, it kind of looks bad that after the Levinson Inquiry Part 1, after their findings, David Cameron was like, you know what, I don't actually think we need to put anything into law to fix any of these issues with journalism in this country. And there's no need for Levinson Part 2, which would have focused on police participation with journalists and hacking. He talks about this on a personal level. He doesn't want anyone else going through what he went through, but also on a national level where he believes that the government and the state of their press is at rock bottom. Quote, "Democracy fails when your press fails to scrutinize and hold the government accountable and instead choose to get into bed with them so they can ensure the status quo." End quote. And if you've watched my Rebecca Brooks deep dive, you know the way that some of these editors are very, very close with prime ministers and other people in government. He also brings up Piers Morgan, who was the editor of the Daily Mirror between 1995 and 2004, and how he and Meghan have been subjected to a barrage of personal attacks, presumably to make him step down and step away from this case. He also alludes to why this case wasn't brought forth sooner, and that is a lot of this information is more recent. And specifically with the Murdoch claim, his family went into a secret agreement so that they would not come after Murdoch and sue. And I think part of that was Murdoch trying to run the clock out for the statute of limitations. He talks about how the issue is not just the journalists who engaged in this behavior, but the higher-ups that encouraged it and covered it up. In regards to MGM, he says, quote, "They admit that phone hacking and other unlawful information gathering went on, but on the other, they deny liability for every claim that's been brought against them, including my own. They admit people were doing it, but deny the victims' claims." And then it goes onward. It's giving, sorry, I ain't sorry. Now let's go back to the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. He opens with background information about him and his relationship with the press. In his experience, each member of the royal family gets cast in a certain mold. Quote, "You start off as a blank canvas while they work out what kind of person you are and what kind of problems and temptations you might have." End quote. He goes on to say that he felt like after a while he was almost playing into these headlines and these ideas of him. He does say that, of course, his successes would be reported on, but it seemed like the press took more pleasure in knocking him down and seeing relationships ruined. He goes on to say that, of course, when he puts on a suit and tie and attends royal engagements, he expects press and photogs. There might even be some when he's arriving or leaving the event. But outside of that, there's a level of privacy which has never existed to him and presumably his brother. Recall, William's lawyer sent a letter after the Rose Hanbury allegations that his human rights were being violated, his right to privacy, even though he is a prince. And everyone has some amount of privacy that they deserve. As we've talked about before, he states that it felt like the press felt like they deserved access to every waking moment of his life. And not just his, but his family, his friends, anyone in his orbit. He makes it very clear that this is not just him. Other people are impacted by this. And the distrust that he grew to have in people around him because he couldn't understand how some of this information was making it to the papers until later. And this is a line that's being quoted a lot, There also seems to be a real blurring of the lines in terms of what is in the public interest and what is of interest to the public, end quote. He talks about some of the people he would have contacted during the relevant period. That's the period that he is suing the Mirror Group for alleged phone hacking, voicemail interception, blagging. He talks about Mark Dyer, who was his royal equerry, Catherine, William, his father, Patty Harverson, the list goes on. Obviously, Chelsea Davies, who's really a focus of this because that's who he was dating during this period. He also brings up this idea that he was born into a contractual relationship he never agreed to. And I think that is really interesting and something to think about. I'm even thinking about it in terms of just social media child stars that are growing up now and the fact that they didn't have rights either, but they should. Anyway, I think that's an interesting discussion for another time. Prince Harry then goes into unusual phone activity, getting voicemails he was hearing for the first time that weren't actually new voicemail notifications suddenly disappearing, missed calls and hang-ups, which are now associated with phone hacking. This statement is telling and also pretty sad. Quote, "As I am uncovering the extent of the unlawful activities carried out by MGN's journalists and senior executives towards me, I feel somewhat relieved to know that my paranoia towards my friends and family had, in fact, been misplaced, although feel sad for how much it impacted my adolescence." End quote. We then get into around 25 pages of disclosure. He kicks it off with his shock at the number of payments made by MGM to private investigators who are known to engage in illegal activities such as phone hacking. Number 36, quote, "Specifically, there were 135 separate payments for me and a further 154 for my associates, which I understand from my solicitors are huge numbers in the context of this litigation, especially considering that the defendant is known to have concealed and destroyed evidence of their wrongdoing on an industrial scale." End quote. He also brings up his mother and how he believes Piers Morgan unlawfully gained information about her friendship with Mr. Michael Barrymore. This is from Piers' book, The Private Diaries of a Scandalous Decade. He says of Barrymore that he heard rumors that Diana had been secretly comforting him. The assumption is that this information was obtained through voicemail hacking. And then we get into the articles under complaint, which are many. And a common theme is that most of the journalists are known to the court to have engaged in unlawful practices or worked with private investigators who engage in those practices. And that in some cases, a source close to the prince or palace aides could just be unlawfully obtained information. He talks a lot about how the palace reacts to stories that are brought to them. They're not proactive, so some of the information that journalists were bringing to the palace was questionable. One example is from January 2003 about Harry joining the military. He brings up that he was really only talking to his father and Mark Dyer about this, and that would have been while he was at Eton, so a lot of time over the phone. So he finds the quotes attributed to other people to be very suspect given how closely guarded and private these conversations were. It's pretty eye-opening and interesting to go through the articles and get Harry's read on them. And this is just my thought after reading this. A lot of this points to information being obtained illegally, and or it is a huge accusation against the British royal family for leaking against one of their own in this larger systemic issue. Which make sure you follow me if you haven't already, because that's what I talk about. But also the fact that no one is willing to make meaningful change because everyone is in bed with the press, including the government. Again, it goes back to that personal claim and the larger picture. I think it's safe to say we will see some of these themes included in other court cases. Stay tuned for more.